A former Marine defends his Texas ranch against a ruthless cartel, turning his land into a war zone. But just when he thinks the fight is over, he learns the real enemy hasn't even shown up yet. John Bull Harrison sat in his dimly lit living room, a glass of whiskey in one hand, his other hand resting on the worn grip of his .45. The Texas night stretched out before him, quiet except for the occasional rustling of the wind through the dry brush. His farmhouse, nestled deep in his property, had always been a fortress of solitude, until now. A soft beep from his security system cut through the silence. John's eyes flicked to the monitor mounted on the wall. Grainy footage from his perimeter cameras showed movement, shadowy figures slipping through the fence line. He leaned in, counting at least 6, possibly more. They moved with purpose, weapons in hand, their silhouettes barely visible in the moonlight. His gut tightened. He'd dealt with trouble before, but this wasn't the usual trespasser or some punk looking for easy pickings. This was different, professional, coordinated. He knew exactly who they were, the cartel. He set the whiskey down, his mind shifting into combat mode. His military training, honed over years of service, took over. He moved swiftly through the house, activating his security measures. Floodlights blazed to life, cutting through the darkness, casting long shadows across the fields. Loudspeakers crackled as a pre-recorded warning played. "You are trespassing on private property. Leave now, or you will be met with force." No response. The intruders kept advancing, undeterred. John's lips pressed into a hard line. They weren't just testing the waters, they were here for blood. He rushed to his gun locker, keying in the code with steady fingers. The door clicked open, revealing an arsenal he had built over the years. He grabbed his customized AR-15, slung extra magazines over his shoulder, and secured his Kevlar vest. His mind raced through potential scenarios. They would try to overwhelm him fast, knowing a prolonged fight would attract attention. He had to hit them first, hit them hard. Outside, the cartel men spread out, moving toward the house in a loose formation. One of them raised a hand, signaling the others. John could see their breath in the cool air as they prepared to strike. He took his position near the second-floor window, resting his rifle on the sill. His finger hovered over the trigger as he steadied his breathing. The first shot had to count. One of the men knelt by the fence, pulling something from his pack. Bolt cutters. John exhaled slowly, then squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked, the suppressor muting most of the noise. The man crumpled, his weapon clattering to the dirt. Chaos erupted. The others dove for cover, shouting in Spanish. Muzzle flashes lit up the night as they fired blindly toward the house. Bullets punched into the wooden siding, shattering a window nearby. John moved quickly, shifting positions before returning fire. Another attacker dropped, clutching his chest. They hadn't expected resistance like this. John switched to his security feed, scanning the cameras. More of them were coming from the south, moving through the tree line. He cursed under his breath. They were trying to flank him. He sprinted downstairs, grabbing a remote detonator from his desk. With a press of a button, a set of buried charges erupted in a fiery explosion. The blast sent dirt and shrapnel flying, cutting off their approach. Screams echoed through the night. Those who weren't caught in the blast scrambled for cover. John reloaded, his heart pounding. He knew this wasn't over. The cartel wouldn't back down so easily. And somewhere in the darkness, their leader was watching, planning his next move. The smell of gunpowder filled the air as John moved through the house, staying low. His ears rang from the gunfire, but his mind remained sharp. He had wounded the cartel's assault, but they weren't retreating. Not yet. Outside, the attackers regrouped behind overturned ATVs and a rusted cattle trough. John could hear them shouting in Spanish, their voices sharp with frustration. He peeked through a shattered window. One of the men, likely in charge, gestured wildly toward the house. Then came the first real counterattack. A bright flash erupted from the tree line. An RPG. John barely had time to react. He dove behind the heavy oak dining table as an explosion ripped through his front porch. Splinters rained down, fire licking at the edges of the doorway. The blast sent a shockwave through the house, shattering more windows. "Shit," he muttered, pushing himself up. They weren't playing games anymore. He needed to change the fight. Holding his ground wasn't an option if they kept escalating. He grabbed his shotgun, slung it over his back, and switched to his sidearm. Then, moving fast, he made his way toward the back door. The security system gave him an edge. With a tap on his tablet, he activated another defensive measure. Hidden turrets near the barn whirred to life. The automated guns opened fire, spitting lead into the night. Screams followed. The cartel hadn't expected that. Using the distraction, John slipped out the back, keeping low behind the corral. The night was thick with smoke and dust. He could see movement, 2 men circling toward the barn, rifles at the ready. He let them come closer. When they were nearly on top of him, he struck. John rose from cover, firing 2 precise shots. The first man dropped instantly, the second staggered back, clutching his side. Before he could react, John closed the distance, driving the butt of his pistol into the man's skull. He crumpled. A deep voice barked orders from the distance. John recognized the name in the mix of Spanish curses, Luis El Cazador. So the cartel's top enforcer was here. El Cazador had built a reputation for tracking and eliminating enemies of the cartel. If he was leading this attack, they weren't just here to scare John off. They were here to take everything. A truck roared to life. The cartel was repositioning. He saw headlights bouncing through the darkness, engines revving as they prepared another assault. John sprinted back toward the house, sliding inside just as a barrage of bullets slammed into the walls. They were testing his defenses again, seeing how much resistance he had left. But John wasn't done yet. He grabbed a scoped rifle from his arsenal and climbed to the attic, finding a perfect vantage point. Through the scope, he saw El Cazador standing near one of the vehicles, speaking into a radio. John's finger tightened on the trigger. Then, El Cazador did something unexpected. He raised a hand. The shooting stopped. Silence settled over the battlefield. Then came the final words, carried by the wind. "We'll be back." John watched as the cartel members dragged their wounded, loading them into trucks. Engines roared, headlights flickered, and just like that, they were gone. But John knew better than to celebrate. They hadn't given up. They were simply regrouping. And the next time they came, they wouldn't underestimate him. John sat on the edge of his bed, his body aching from the fight. The farmhouse was in bad shape. Windows shattered, walls splintered, scorch marks from the explosion still smoldering on the front porch. He had survived, but he wasn't foolish enough to think it was over. The cartel had tested his defenses. Now they would return stronger. He reached for his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the name he needed. Jake Thompson. John hesitated for only a second before hitting call. The line rang twice before a familiar deep voice answered. "Didn't expect to hear from you, Bull," Jake said. "I've got a problem," John replied, wasting no time. "Cartel tried hitting my place tonight. They'll be back." A pause. Then Jake's tone shifted. "How bad?" "Bad enough. They sent a team, led by some enforcer named El Cazador. We took a few of them out, but they'll come heavier next time." "Shit," Jake muttered. "You need backup?" "That's why I'm calling." John could hear movement on the other end. Jake was already gearing up. "I'll round up some of the boys. We'll be there soon." "Appreciate it." "You know they won't stop, right?" Jake said. "Once the cartel sets its sights on you, they'll burn everything down to get what they want." John clenched his jaw. Let them try. He hung up, exhaling slowly. Help was on the way, but he knew it might not be enough. Elsewhere in Mar-a-Lago, Donald Trump leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing as he listened to the urgent briefing. "This happened tonight?" he asked, drumming his fingers on the desk. "Yes, sir," his aide confirmed. "John Harrison, former Marine, Texas rancher. He fought off a cartel assault on his property. Reports suggest they're planning another attack." Trump pursed his lips. He had heard of John Harrison before. The man was a patriot, the kind of fighter America needed more of. And now, the cartel was trying to take him down. Unacceptable. He turned to his aide. "Get me in touch with Governor Abbott. I want eyes on this. And tell our contacts, any former operators still loyal to the cause, I want them ready to move." The aide nodded and rushed out. Trump leaned forward, staring at the screen in front of him. He knew the cartel problem had been festering for too long. Maybe this was the moment to send a message. Back in Texas, John spent the next hour reinforcing his defenses. He set up new motion sensors, repositioned security cameras, and checked his ammo supply. Every movement was calculated, every decision made with the knowledge that the next assault would be worse. He stepped outside, the cool Texas air filling his lungs. The night was quiet again, but it was a deceptive silence. Somewhere out there in the darkness beyond his fence line, the cartel was preparing. They weren't retreating, they were regrouping. And John would be ready. The desert air was heavy with anticipation. Miles away from John's farmhouse in a secluded ranch near the Texas-Mexico border, Rafael El Lobo Moreno paced in front of a long wooden table. His dark eyes burned with fury. The failure of the first assault was unacceptable. His men had underestimated the old Marine, and now bodies had been left behind, a stain on the cartel's reputation. "El Cazador," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "Explain yourself." Luis, El Cazador, stood rigid, his face impassive. "We didn't expect that level of resistance. Harrison is more prepared than we thought." El Lobo scoffed. "So you ran?" Cazador's jaw tightened. "We pulled back to avoid unnecessary losses, but we've confirmed his defenses. We know what we're up against." El Lobo slammed his fist on the table. "I don't want excuses. I want results." The room was silent. Around them, heavily armed sicarios stood at attention, waiting for orders. El Lobo inhaled sharply, regaining control of his temper. "This time, we go in hard. No more games, full force, armored vehicles, RPGs, machine guns. I want that property leveled, and I want Harrison's head." "El Cazador," he continued, his tone colder now. "This is your last chance. Don't disappoint me again." Cazador nodded. "We leave at dawn." Back at the farm, John knelt by the perimeter fence, securing the last tripwire. The explosives were hidden, carefully placed beneath the dirt. Anything heavier than a coyote stepping on them would trigger an eruption of shrapnel and fire. The previous night's battle had cost him. His house was scarred, his resources dwindling, but he wasn't done fighting. A soft vibration in his pocket made him pause. He pulled out his phone. A message from Jake. "2 hours out. Hold the line." John smirked. At least he wouldn't be alone for this next round. But his confidence was short-lived. In the distance, a faint rumble echoed through the night. At first, it was just a tremor, barely noticeable. Then it grew louder. Engines, heavy ones. He grabbed his binoculars and scanned the horizon. His stomach tightened. A convoy, dozens of vehicles, armored SUVs, dirt bikes, even an old repurposed military truck carrying a mounted machine gun. And behind them, more men. Dozens, maybe 100. They weren't just here to fight. They were here to end him. John exhaled slowly, forcing his heartbeat to steady. He retreated toward the farmhouse, locking the door behind him. He had minutes, maybe less. The first gunshot shattered the silence. A cartel sniper had fired, testing the range. The bullet cracked against the side of his barn, sending a spray of wood splinters flying. Then, the real assault began. Gunfire erupted from all sides. The cartel advanced, their bullets slamming into the farmhouse. Windows shattered, walls trembled. John returned fire from the second-floor window, dropping the first wave of attackers before they could reach the fence. The security turrets engaged, cutting down several more. A deep explosion rocked the ground. One of the tripwires had been triggered. Flames shot into the sky, sending bodies flying. But the cartel kept coming. John reloaded, shifting position. He had planned for this, but he had never faced this many enemies alone. A new sound reached his ears. A metallic clink against the wooden floor. His eyes widened. Grenade. John dove for cover as the explosion tore through the lower floor, blasting furniture and debris across the room. He coughed, shaking off the shock. Through the smoke, he saw movement. Cartel soldiers breaching the house, rifles raised. He aimed, fired. 2 men dropped, but more poured in. He fell back, moving toward his last defensive position. He was running out of time. Outside, El Cazador watched the attack unfold, a cruel smile on his lips. "Let's see how long you last, Bull." John's lungs burned as he pushed himself up from the floor, coughing through the thick smoke. The grenade had blasted a hole through his living room wall, exposing the farmhouse's interior to the oncoming cartel forces. Footsteps pounded against the wooden porch. They were inside. He moved fast, slipping behind an overturned couch for cover. He switched to his shotgun, knowing the fight was about to get close and ugly. The first Sicario stepped through the wreckage, his rifle raised. Boom! John fired, the shotgun's blast tearing through the man's chest. The body crumpled before his boot hit the floor. Another attacker followed, shouting orders in Spanish. John swung the shotgun toward him and pulled the trigger again. The man's body slammed into the remains of the dining table. More were coming. Too many. John darted toward the hallway, barely avoiding the hail of bullets that tore through the walls behind him. He needed to move to regroup. He sprinted up the stairs using the smoke and debris as cover. Outside, the siege intensified. The cartel had cut off every escape route. Vehicles blocked the roads, snipers positioned on nearby hills, and foot soldiers advanced steadily, methodically. This wasn't just a raid, it was a full-scale assault. Fighting back, John reached the second floor, his hands moving on instinct as he grabbed his rifle and checked his ammo. He had one advantage. They still didn't know exactly where he was. Through the shattered window, he spotted a squad moving toward the barn, likely trying to flank him. He steadied his rifle, controlled his breathing, and fired. The first shot dropped the lead man. The second sent another scrambling for cover. The remaining attackers dove behind a rusted tractor. John adjusted his aim. He had rigged the barn with explosives earlier that night, knowing it might come to this. He took a deep breath, lined up his shot, and fired at the fuel barrels inside. The explosion roared across the night, a fireball consuming the entire structure. The force of the blast sent bodies flying. He didn't stop. He shifted his aim toward the advancing forces near his porch, picking them off one by one. But even as he fought, he knew he couldn't hold forever. The cartel was adapting. They were using numbers, pressing in from multiple angles. Then through the chaos, he heard something, a low buzz in the distance. Drones. John smirked. He had one last trick up his sleeve. Grabbing a remote control from his vest, he activated the custom-built drones he had hidden in the fields. They lifted into the air, their infrared cameras locking onto the cartel forces. Within seconds, the machines rained down small explosives, detonating in controlled bursts. Confusion spread among the attackers as the ground erupted around them. Some scattered. Others fired wildly into the sky. John took advantage of the moment. He repositioned, conserving his remaining ammo. The fight wasn't over, but he had bought himself time. Reinforcements on the way miles away. Jake Thompson and his small team of veterans raced through the desert in 2 armored trucks. The radio crackled with updates. "He's still holding, but it's bad," one of the men reported. "They've got him surrounded." Jake clenched his jaw. "Then we break the damn siege." They weren't just coming to help, they were coming for war. The calm before the next storm. Back at the farmhouse, John exhaled sharply, reloading his last magazine. His house was half destroyed, the land around him burning, bodies littering the field. The cartel had thrown everything at him, and he was still standing. But he wasn't naive. El Lobo wasn't finished, and the worst was yet to come. The battlefield had fallen into a tense silence. Smoke still curled from burning debris, the air thick with the metallic scent of blood and gunpowder. John crouched near what remained of his second-floor window, his rifle resting on the ledge. His body ached, exhaustion clawing at his limbs, but he couldn't afford to stop. Not yet. The cartel had pulled back, not because they were giving up, but because they were planning something worse. His radio crackled to life. He snatched it up, expecting Jake's voice. Instead, a deep, smooth tone filled the static. "Senor Harrison," John tensed. He knew that voice. El Lobo. "I must admit," the cartel leader continued, "I underestimated you. I expected resistance, see, but not this. You are impressive." John's grip tightened. "I'll take that as a compliment." A low chuckle. "It is. You've cost me good men, and I do not take that lightly." John scanned the perimeter. His night vision scope picked up movement beyond the tree line. Dozens of figures just out of firing range. They weren't leaving. They were waiting. El Lobo sighed theatrically. "But I am a reasonable man, Harrison, so I offer you a choice." John said nothing, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. "You are alone, outnumbered. Your house is in ruins. You can fight to the bitter end, die a painful death, and accomplish nothing, or you can walk away, surrender the land, disappear, and I let you live." John exhaled slowly. He had expected this. Cartels didn't just kill when they didn't have to. They manipulated, broke people down until they surrendered without a fight. Too bad for them. "I've got a counteroffer," John said. "You pack up your men, haul your sorry asses back to Mexico, and I don't put a bullet between your eyes." Silence. Then another chuckle, this one colder. "I respect your spirit, Harrison. Truly I do. But I wonder, is it worth dying over? You think you can win this fight alone?" John hesitated for only a fraction of a second. That was enough for El Lobo to pounce. "I know about Jake and his men," the cartel leader continued. "They are coming. But let me tell you what will happen. They will not reach you in time. They will die trying. And then I will burn your land to the ground." John's pulse remained steady, but inside, he felt the weight of the words. The cartel had resources, intelligence networks. They knew everything. El Lobo sighed. "Think, Harrison. Be smart. What is this all for? You cannot stop us." John stared out into the darkness. His land, his home, was torn apart. His body bore the bruises of the battle. But it wasn't about land. It wasn't even about survival. It was about sending a message. "You're right, Lobo," John said finally. "I can't stop you." A pause. Then El Lobo exhaled, relieved. "Good, then, but I sure as hell can make you bleed." John shut off the radio and hurled it aside. He wasn't playing their game. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., Donald Trump leaned back in his chair, watching the classified report unfold on the screen before him. He had read about the cartel's growing power in Texas. But this? An open war? His aide cleared his throat. "Sir, we have former operatives willing to intervene. They're awaiting your signal." Trump tapped a finger on the desk. He had his reservations about getting directly involved. But John Harrison was an American, a patriot, standing alone against an army. And Trump never left a good fighter behind. He turned to his aide. "Tell them to move." The final hours before the storm. Back in Texas, John reinforced his last line of defense, setting up explosives along the main road. He knew the next attack wouldn't be a simple firefight. It would be a slaughter. He could only hope Jake and the reinforcements would arrive before it was too late. But if they didn't, then he'd make sure the cartel paid the price for every damn step they took. The night was long, but John didn't rest. Every breath he took was laced with dust and gunpowder. Every muscle in his body screamed for relief. But there was no time for exhaustion, only action. The cartel had given him a choice: surrender or die. He chose a third option. From his attic window, he scanned the tree line. The cartel hadn't attacked yet, but they were out there waiting, planning. Then, a faint vibration. His phone. John snatched it up. "Jake, we're here." His old friend's voice came through, calm but urgent. "A mile out, moving in slow. How bad?" John exhaled. "Bad. We got a dozen guys, well armed, but we're punching into a hornet's nest. You got a plan?" John's lips curled into a grim smile. "Oh yeah." The setup. 15 minutes later, Jake and his team, grizzled veterans, each one as battle-hardened as John, slipped onto the property. They moved like ghosts, barely making a sound. Jake clapped a hand on John's shoulder. "Damn, Bull, you look like hell." "Feel worse," John admitted. "But I'm still breathing." Jake smirked. "Let's keep it that way." John laid out the plan. The cartel thought they had him trapped, but that was their mistake. He knew the land better than they ever could. Every ridge, every dry creek bed, every blind spot. He'd use it all. "The explosives are set along the south road," John said. "Once they move in, we blow it, cut them off." Jake nodded. "And then?" John's eyes darkened. "Then we hunt." The night falls silent. El Cazador stood near his armored SUV, watching the farmhouse. The silence unnerved him. Harrison should have been scrambling, panicking. Instead, he waited. That meant one thing: a trap. He exhaled through his nose, gripping his rifle tighter. "Boss," one of his men whispered, "should we move?" Cazador hesitated. El Lobo wanted this over quickly, but charging in blindly? No. "We wait," he ordered. "Let them make the first mistake." But John wasn't about to make one. The first strike. The night silence shattered with an explosion. Flames roared as the cartel's lead truck was torn apart, flipping onto its roof. Shouts rang through the darkness as men scrambled for cover. Then, from the shadows, gunfire. John and his team struck fast and hard, picking off the disoriented cartel soldiers. Jake's voice crackled over the radio. "Moving up. Left flank secure." John fired 3 precise shots, dropping a Sicario before ducking behind a smoldering log. "Keep pushing," he ordered. "Make them feel it." The cartel returned fire, but they were losing ground. The night belonged to John and his men. The tide turns. El Cazador snarled. "Hold your positions. Regroup." His men scrambled, trying to reorganize, but John's team never let up. From the tree line, one of Jake's snipers took out a cartel gunner. Another blast rocked the battlefield. Another trap triggered. Cazador clenched his jaw. This was going south. Then over the radio, El Lobo's voice. "Fall back." Cazador's stomach twisted. "But I said fall back!" Cazador cursed, signaling his men. They began retreating, dragging their wounded, fleeing into the night. John stood from cover, watching the cartel forces scatter. He reloaded, breathing heavily. They had won this round, but it wasn't over. Not yet. John stepped over the smoldering wreckage, rifle steady against his shoulder. The battlefield was quiet now. The cartel forces scattered into the darkness. The flames from the burning vehicles flickered, casting long shadows over the land. But John knew this wasn't over, not until El Lobo was dead. Through the smoke, Jake approached, wiping blood from a cut on his forehead. "They're pulling out, Bull. We send them running." John shook his head. "Not all of them." A radio crackled in the distance. One of the fallen sicarios lay face down in the dirt, his radio still active. John knelt, picking it up. "El Cazador!" a voice snarled through the static. John pressed the button. "He's not answering." Silence. Then a low, amused chuckle. "Ah, Senor Harrison." El Lobo. "You fight well," the cartel leader continued, his voice calm, confident. "But you have only delayed the inevitable." John's grip tightened. "Come see for yourself." Another chuckle. "Oh, I intend to." The radio went dead. John exhaled. He could feel it in his bones. The final fight was coming. The final hunt. Jake reloaded his rifle. "So what's the move?" John's eyes flicked toward the ridge beyond his property. If El Lobo was anything like he imagined, he wouldn't run. He'd try to finish this himself. "We go to him," John said. Jake smirked. "Thought you'd say that." The two men moved quickly, cutting through the scorched fields. The night air was thick with smoke, but John's senses were razor-sharp. His instincts told him exactly where El Lobo would be. The old hunting cabin on the outskirts of the property. It was where John had taken down bigger predators before. This time, the prey had a name. The Final Stand. As they neared the cabin, a single light flickered inside. Jake moved to the side, ready to breach, but John raised a hand. "I go in alone," he said. Jake frowned. "Bull, this is my fight." A long pause, then Jake nodded. "I'll be right here." John stepped forward, rifle raised, and pushed open the door. Inside, El Lobo stood near a wooden table, a glass of whiskey in his hand. His sharp eyes flicked to John, a small smirk curling his lips. "No gun?" John asked, keeping his own weapon steady. El Lobo took a slow sip. "I prefer to finish things with my hands." John scoffed. "That a fact?" The cartel leader set the glass down. "You've caused me much trouble, Harrison, but you are just one man." John tightened his grip. One man was enough. El Lobo moved fast. Before John could fire, the cartel leader lunged, slamming into him with brutal force. The rifle clattered to the ground as the two men crashed against the wall. John swung, his fist connecting with El Lobo's ribs. The cartel boss grunted but retaliated with a vicious elbow to John's face. Pain exploded in his skull, but he stayed on his feet. They grappled, each trying to gain the upper hand. Then El Lobo pulled a knife. John barely dodged the first slash, feeling the blade skim his arm. Blood dripped, but he ignored it. He grabbed El Lobo's wrist, twisting hard. The knife clattered to the floor. El Lobo roared, driving John back against the table. For a moment, John saw stars. His body screamed for rest. Then he saw the knife. With a last surge of strength, he grabbed it and plunged it deep into El Lobo's gut. The cartel leader gasped, his eyes wide in shock. Blood seeped between his fingers as he staggered backward. John stepped closer, his voice low. "You should have run." El Lobo collapsed. It was over. The aftermath, Jake rushed in, rifle raised. He took one look at the scene and exhaled. "Damn, Bull." John wiped the blood from his face, his body trembling from adrenaline. "It's done." Outside, the night was finally quiet. The wolf had been slain, but John knew one thing for certain. There would always be another hunt. The air inside the cabin was thick with the stench of blood and sweat. John stood over El Lobo's lifeless body, his own breath coming in short, ragged bursts. His knuckles ached, his side burned where the knife had cut him, but none of that mattered now. It was over. Jake stepped forward, nudging the cartel boss's corpse with his boot. "Damn, Bull. You really don't do things halfway, do you?" John exhaled, wiping the blood from his lip. "Not my style." Jake cracked a grin, but the moment was brief. Outside, the night was still alive with distant gunfire. The cartel forces that had retreated were still in the area, likely trying to regroup. John reloaded his rifle. "We're not done yet," Jake nodded. "Then let's finish it." The last stand. The two men moved fast, cutting through the trees, using the smoke and darkness as cover. In the distance, cartel survivors were scrambling, shouting orders, trying to figure out what the hell had just happened. John and Jake weren't about to give them time to think. They struck like ghosts. John fired first, taking down a man near the trucks. Jake flanked left, putting another two down before they even realized they were under attack. Panic spread among the cartel's remaining soldiers. "They're falling apart," Jake shouted over the gunfire. John saw it too. Without El Lobo, they had no leader, no direction. They were just bodies with guns, and bodies without a plan were easy targets. Then, in the distance, headlights. A convoy of black SUVs roared down the dirt road, kicking up dust. But these weren't cartel reinforcements. Federal agents. John let out a slow breath. Took him long enough. Helicopter blades cut through the air as the first SUV skidded to a stop. Armed men in tactical gear poured out, opening fire on the remaining cartel forces. The cartel panicked. Some tried to fight. Others turned to flee. John had no intention of letting them go. He and Jake pushed forward, cutting down the last of the resistance. The gunfire was relentless, echoing through the valley, until silence. And just like that, it was over. The price of war. The battlefield was nothing but smoke and bodies. The farmhouse was in ruins, the land scorched, but John had won. He slung his rifle over his shoulder, his body heavy with exhaustion. As he walked back toward the wreckage of his home, one of the federal agents approached. "John Harrison?" John glanced at him. "Yeah." The man studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Hell of a fight you put up," John smirked. "Ain't my first." The agent didn't push further. Instead, he gestured toward the wreckage. "You're gonna need some help cleaning this up." John exhaled, looking over the destruction. "Yeah, but first I need a drink." The last goodbye. By sunrise, the cleanup had begun. Federal teams were securing the area, while Jake and his men gathered what was left of John's supplies. Jake leaned against one of the trucks, watching the sunrise. "So, what now?" John stared at the horizon. "Rebuild," Jake chuckled. "That's simple, huh?" John turned to him, eyes steady. "Ain't got much choice." The two men shook hands. "We'll be around if you need us," Jake said. John nodded. "I know." As the dust settled and the last bodies were taken away, John stood alone on his land. It was broken, battered, burned, but it was still his. And no one was ever going to take it from him again. The morning light painted the battlefield in harsh reality. Smoke curled from the ruins of the farmhouse, the air thick with the scent of burnt wood, blood, and gunpowder. John stood in the middle of it all, his boots sinking into the dirt, his body heavy with exhaustion. He had won, but at what cost? The land he had fought for was in ruins. His home, what was left of it, was a skeleton of broken beams and shattered walls. Bullet casings and blood stained the ground. The echoes of war still lingered in the silence. Nearby, Jake and his men were finishing their sweep. The last cartel bodies were being loaded into black trucks, their presence wiped from the land like they had never been there. The Federals were thorough. Jake approached, a bottle of whiskey in hand. "Figure you could use this," he said, tossing it over. John caught it, twisting the cap off and taking a slow, burning sip. "Damn right," Jake sighed, surveying the wreckage. "You staying?" John took another sip before answering. "Yeah," Jake chuckled. "Of course you are." They both knew John wouldn't leave. He had bled for this land, fought tooth and nail to protect it. Running was never an option. A call from the top John's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the number, hesitating before answering. "John Harrison," the familiar voice greeted him. "You sure know how to make headlines." John exhaled. "Mr. President," Donald Trump's voice was calm but firm. "Hell of a fight you put up." "Did what I had to," John replied. Trump paused. "You sent a message, son. Loud and clear. The cartel took a hit they won't recover from anytime soon." John wasn't so sure. "They'll be back. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next year, but they don't forget." Trump was silent for a moment. Then, "That's why you're getting help." John frowned. "Help? You think I'm just gonna let a man like you stand alone?" Trump said. "I've got people. Men who don't take kindly to cartels thinking they own this country. You'll have eyes on your land, Harrison. And if anyone comes knocking again," John smirked. "I'll handle it," Trump chuckled. "I don't doubt it." The call ended. John slipped the phone back into his pocket, staring out over his ruined land. Maybe things weren't over just yet. A lone shadow. As the sun climbed higher, Jake and the others packed up. It was time for them to go. "You ever need a hand," Jake said, slapping John on the shoulder. "You know where to find me." John nodded. "Same goes for you." Jake and his men drove off, their trucks kicking up dust as they disappeared down the road. And then for the first time in days, John was truly alone. He walked through what remained of his farmhouse, running his fingers along the bullet-ridden walls. Memories flooded back. The quiet mornings, the long nights, the peace that once existed here. It was all gone, but not forever. John set the whiskey bottle down on the porch, what was left of it, and picked up a hammer instead. He would rebuild. And if the cartel, or anyone else, ever came for him again, they'd find out the hard way. John Harrison wasn't a man to be broken. True strength isn't just about firepower. It's about resilience, about standing your ground even when the odds are against you. John Harrison fought not just for his land, but for his principles, proving that some battles are worth every sacrifice. But in a world where enemies lurk in the shadows, the real question is, what would you have done in his place? Would you have stood and fought, or would you have walked away? Click the video on the screen to continue your journey of self-discovery and see what it truly takes to face impossible odds. And don't forget to subscribe, because sometimes the toughest battles start when you least expect them.